I probably should have given a better title to my talk. I usually give long 19th century introductions, 15, 16 sentences, that all in one title. This time I thought I'd just make it really short, and trick as many of you as I could to come into it. We start off with the characters of the Book of Mormon. Me and a colleague wrote a book on how the book was translated, some of which, the time in which Jack has really provided a very amazing analysis of here. I always like to start with this because in a room of everyone studying the Book of Mormon, I'm hoping someone can read these characters. There's some that are repeating. You could probably get upside down birthday cake here, upside down birthday cake. Lots of upside down birthday cakes. So I'm thinking any came to pass, right? And we've got backwards fish head, a couple of another backwards fish head. That's probably then Laman and Lemuel sinned again. I don't know what it is. The point being that Joseph, in that short time period that Jack has just illustrated, has to take these characters from this unintelligible script to the manuscript, and as he illustrated, this is a very short amount of time, but it's not the end of the story. We often think that this is the end. At this point, Joseph should be doing very well. But in order to get the book printed, Joseph's going to have to go through several more experiences that we're going to talk about. As Jack already demonstrated, they secured the copyright to the Book of Mormon, but they still have yet to find someone who is willing to publish the book. So I want to talk to you about the various people that they approach for this and what their general responses are, and go through them. Edward Grandin is obviously the name most connected with the printing of the Book of Mormon because he's the one who printed the Book of Mormon. That's freshman level BYU church history for you. But we also, many people don't understand the odyssey it was even get Grandin to agree to do this. Grandin is not willing at first to do this. Now, he's the one most capable of doing it, has the large print shop, has a book bindery, has produced and sells other books there in his shop. This is still something more mammoth than anything he's undertaken, but he at least has the ability to do it. The problem is, he doesn't want to do it. There's some good indication that he's friends with Martin Harris, and perhaps that's part of the reason why. But at least according to a relative, Grandin not only refused to print the book when they were first approached with the idea of printing it, but in fact tried to persuade Martin Harris to not print it. And took that level of persuasion even beyond just Martin Harris. He started to go to all of Martin Harris's friends in town and started to try to build a consensus against him to try to convince him not to print the book. According to this relative, Grandin at once advised him against the supposed folly of the enterprise and also sought to influence Harris to desist and withdraw his financial support. So Grandin is not only unwilling to publish it, he's unwilling to publish it and then is going to try to prevent its publication. This must have been quite a setback early on for Joseph, because I'm sure Martin had told him, oh, no worry, I'm sure we'll be able to convince my friend Grandin to print this book. And then when presented with it, yes, Grandin will publish the publication notice in his book. He'll publish the title page in his newspaper. But along with it, with a sarcastic commentary saying, it's pretended that this book will soon be published here. I mean, but it probably doesn't sound like he's planning to publish it himself, or he's very self-deprecating. So after Grandin's refusal, the next printer that they're going to go to is one that we don't know a whole lot about and is not as well known. This is Jonathan Hadley. Jonathan Hadley is a phenom in the printing world, in fact. He's only 20 years old. And so if you can imagine Joseph and Jonathan Hadley having this conversation about publication, we're not talking about a whole lot of experience either way for these men that are involved in these negotiations. Hadley is the editor of a newspaper called the Palmyra Freeman. The Palmyra Freeman is, as the name implies, a heavily anti-Masonic political paper. And he publishes in his paper all the time, oh, I can publish anything, you name it, invitations, postcards, books, he can do anything, except not this, obviously. When Joseph comes to him and presents him the idea of 5,000 copies of a nearly 600-page book, that's a little bit more than the ramage press, the kind of tumble-down press that he has is going to be able to do. Certainly beyond his capabilities. And that's to say nothing of his ability to bind it. But Hadley does not simply tell Joseph no. Instead, he points Joseph in the direction of someone who might be able to print the book. Instead of sending him somewhere nearby, he sends him to the master that he apprenticed under. This is Thurlow Weed. Thurlow Weed's the editor of the Anti-Masonic Inquirer. He's going to become very famous in American history as one of the founders of the Whig Party and one of the main founders of the Republican Party as well. The person who nearly succeeds in getting William Seward nominated to be President of the United States in 1860. We all know Abraham Lincoln ends up getting that, so it probably turned out better that way. But Thurlow Weed also has printed multiple things in his life. And so when Joseph and Martin Harris arrive there, it's actually fairly difficult to figure out how their conversations went. One of the reasons why is Weed will give numerous different accounts of these publication negotiations throughout his life. Thurlow Weed is a lifelong politician, and I know it's hard to believe that as a politician he might say things that are not exactly true or change his story based upon the political circumstances at the time. But imagine a world where someone with political ambitions may say something that may not exactly be true all the time. He will, in his earliest account of this negotiation, say that he simply told them, well, we aren't in the book printing business, go find somebody else. Over the course of time, that story becomes broader and broader and broader. You can see this in one of the quotes that he gives. Disgusted with what we deem to be a weak invention and not caring to strip Harris of his hard earnings, the proposition was declined. He also went on to say that he claimed that he advised Harris not to mortgage his farm and beggar his family, trying to convince him not to pay for the printing of the book. Probably the most fascinating thing is that as time goes on and Mormonism becomes more and more of a pariah in 19th century America, it becomes the equivalent of obvious moral evil by the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. Weed's conversation will change to match the times. He starts off by saying, well, we weren't in the process, we weren't in the business of publishing books, so I said no. And then he goes to, well, I knew that this was morally wrong, right, as a good politician would. And to the point where he waxes quite poetic in his autobiography, where he essentially is the great defender of the United States, trying to prevent the Book of Mormon from being published. That account also is the account that's the most fascinating to read, because one of the things that Weed claims, and his claims are becoming contradictory at this point, he first says, oh, I just totally dismissed them. But in this later account, he actually admits that he met with them on multiple occasions, which suggests he's not as disinterested as he might have let on in the first place. But that Joseph will return to visit him, and this time with a stone that he'll place in a hat and begin translating it, a demonstration of translation right in front of Thurlow Weed. It's a pretty fascinating discussion. It's not a very pro-Joseph discussion, but hey, it's still fun to read. In the end, Weed is going to say no. So now they've exhausted their abilities in Palmyra. They've traveled to Rochester. They've talked to the person that they were sent there to talk to, one of the more prominent printers there. He's already said no. And what are they going to do now? Well, in point of fact, they find someone after this who will be willing to print the book. Again, we don't know any firsthand aspects of the discussions that surround Elihu Marshall's agreement to publish the book. Marshall also is a well-known printer. He's a direct rival in Rochester of Thurlow Weed, because Thurlow Weed is anti-Masonic and Elihu Marshall is a pro-Mason. But Elihu Marshall is a book printer. In fact, he's the publisher of multiple textbooks that are used by itinerant school teachers. In fact, one of his textbooks is being sold in Grandin's print shop in Palmyra. So it's possible that one of the reasons why they seek out Marshall is Calgary is saying, oh, I teach reading out of this book. Marshall is also a little bit more open in his religious views than many of the other people they've met. He himself is a religious outsider. He was already an outsider because he was a Quaker, and then becomes even more of an outsider because he starts following the teachings of Elias Hicks in the Quaker movement. So he becomes an ostracized Hicksite Quaker, and publishes pretty widely arguments that people should tolerate people's religion, that there should be a freedom of worship, and that people shouldn't be persecuted or treated poorly simply because they believe something differently. If Joseph knew about that, I imagine that Elihu Marshall's sentiments would have been welcome. In any case, Marshall agrees to print the book. We don't know for how much, we don't know how that negotiation went, but we know that he agreed to print the book. Now they return back to Palmyra. They always wanted to print the book in Palmyra, in part because they always wanted to keep the text close to them. As you might imagine, for some crazy reason, they're worried that people might try to steal pages of the book. So they want to be able to maintain as close a control of the pages as they possibly can. If they publish the book in Rochester, this is something they anticipate taking as long as up to a year for publication. They don't live in Rochester, they would have to get room and board the entire time that they're there. It's another major cost, and much harder for them to control the text. So they want to publish it in Palmyra. They come back to Grandin and they say, look, essentially this is going to be published whether you like it or not. We're going to publish this with you or without you. And Grandin at this point, whatever his altruistic motives were before of not printing the book, he seems to have found his capitalist instincts and agrees to print the book. By our calculations, he appears to agree to print it for well over what people generally made in print runs. So he probably is doing pretty well. Again, with friends like this, you don't need enemies, right? He's such a good friend to Harris that he doesn't want to take his farm away from him, but if you're going to make me do it anyway, then I guess I will. The result of this final agreement to print the book also has repercussions inside of Palmyra itself. And they primarily come in the form of Jonathan Hadley's reaction. If you remember, go back here. They'd gone to Hadley probably for various reasons. Hadley said he could print anything, he just couldn't. Hadley was a vocal political opponent of the Wayne Sentinel and of Edward Grandin. Again, Hadley's an anti-Mason, Grandin's paper is pro-Masonic, so they are not friends. In addition to the fact that they are against one another politically, they're also economic rivals. They're the only two papers, at least at the time, that were printing in Palmyra, and then the Reflector's going to come along as well. So they're economic rivals, they're political rivals, and that's probably the reason why Hadley sent them to Thurlow Weed in the first place. Look, I can't, what have I done here? I can't help you, but my master I apprenticed under could, Thurlow Weed. When Hadley finds out that it's not his friend and mentor, Thurlow Weed, who's going to be getting the $3,000 payday for printing this book, but in fact it's his crosstown rival, he is irate to say the least. When he realizes the book is going to be printed by Grandin, Hadley decides that he's going to take the book to task in his paper. And I'm so very glad that he did. The best part about what Jonathan Hadley has to write is that he gives us the earliest account of translation that actually exists. The earliest account of taking the characters to scholars in the East. In fact, he might even be alluding to the earliest account of the first vision. The best part about the earliest anti-Mormon stuff is that they don't know that Mormonism is going to do anything. And if you think about it, Mormonism is already kind of crazy. Right? I mean, if any of us were walking out of this hall today and someone walked up to you and said, "Hey, I just saw an angel," your response would be, "I don't think so," right? And we're Mormons. We believe in the literal ministry of angels, and our first response to someone telling us they saw an angel is, "I don't think so, how much money do you need," right? I think Hadley thinks the same thing. These earliest antagonistic articles about the church, they don't feel like they have to embellish or attack the story. The story itself is crazy. He says an angel appeared to him, folks. That's the end. You don't need more than that. It's only later anti-Mormonism, when the realization comes that people are being converted by this, that there needs to become greater personal attacks. That there needs to become alternative origin theories of the Book of Mormon. That there needs to be attacks upon the text itself because it's converting people. So let's see what Hadley has to say, just to give you at least some kind of dessert for listening. You can see there he's got under the title, The Golden Bible. The greatest piece of superstition that's ever come within the sphere of our knowledge is one which has for some time past and still occupies the attention of a few superstitious and bigoted individuals of this world. Now, bigoted in the 19th century meant stupid, uneducated. I mean, it means that now, but it only meant that then. It generally is known and spoken of as the Golden Bible. Its proselytes give the following account of it. In the fall of 1827, a person by the name of Joseph Smith of Manchester, Ontario County, reported that he'd been visited in a dream by the Spirit of the Almighty. Like I said, this could potentially be him conflating the Moroni visit and the visit of God. In fact, in the 19th century parlance, Christian parlance, the Spirit of the Almighty is never a reference to an angel. Remember, it's Mormons who believe that angels are spirits. Christians don't. We're Christians, but not that kind. And informed that in a certain hill in that town was deposited this golden Bible containing the ancient record of divine nature and origin. And having been thrice thus visited, and at this point Hadley decides he's going to interject to make you know that he doesn't really believe this story. After having thrice been visited, as he states, he proceeded to the spot. So he's worried at this point. You might think that he believes this. The Bible was found together with a huge pair of spectacles. He had been directed, however, not to let any mortal being see them under no less penalty than instant death. That terminology of spectacles, again, is exactly what Joseph Smith is calling the seer stones in the earliest sources. They were therefore nicely wrapped up and excluded from the vulgar gaze of poor wicked mortals. It is said that the leaves of the Bible were plates of gold, about 8 inches long, 6 wide, and 1/8 of an inch thick, on which were engraved characters or hieroglyphics. There are lots of people who give dimensions of the plates. The only person who gives those dimensions of the plates is Joseph Smith in the Wentworth letter. By placing the spectacles in a hat and looking into it, Smith could, he said so at least, couldn't really, but he said so at least, interpret these characters. The account of this discovery was circulated, and the subject was almost invariably treated as it should have been, with contempt. A few, however, believed the golden story, and among them was Martin Harris, an honest and industrious farmer of this town. Even in an article that's attempting to attack the whole idea, Hadley's going to concede, okay, well, Martin Harris is an honest person. Apparently accepted just in this. He goes on to talk about how he takes these characters to the east. That he went in search of someone besides the interpreter who was learned enough to English them, but all to whom he applied were not learned enough, right? Including Professor Mitchell. He references Mitchell, our first reference to Mitchell. Having not been in possession of sufficient knowledge to give satisfaction, Harris returned and set Smith to work interpreting the Bible. He has at length performed the task, and the work is soon to be set to press in this village. Its language and doctrines are said to be superior to those of the Book of Life. And then probably my favorite thing that I'll leave you on here. Now it appears not a little strange that there should have been deposited in this Western world, and in the secluded town of Manchester too, a record of this description. And still more so, that a person like this Smith very illiterate. Should have been gifted by inspiration to find and interpret. The Book of Mormon, in August of 1829, which is when this article is published, has not yet been printed. In fact, it hasn't yet been typeset. In the absence of a book, Hadley is able to claim there's no possible way Joseph Smith produced anything similar to the Bible. I know Joseph Smith. There's no possible way he did that. Which is why this argument's going to be dropped eventually. The odyssey to get the book printed was an arduous one that required faith, one that required Martin Harris to accept a divine revelation from God that commanded him to give up everything he had, alienate his family, one that required Joseph to continually look forward in faith that somehow God would bring the book forward. I am grateful that Joseph Smith and Martin Harris and others were persistent in their efforts to get the Book of Mormon printed so that this book stands as a testament of Jesus Christ and a testament of the restored gospel.